This is Pennsylvania, the Keystone State, one of the original 13 colonies, with a diverse mix of urban, mountain, and rural farming, with the second largest population of Amish in the country. Its most famous city, Philadelphia, where America's forefathers met to declare independence from England. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were signed here. This story is about Pennsylvania National Parks, and this is where we're going. Independence Hall National Historical Park, including the Liberty Bell, Thaddeus Kosciuszko National Monument, Edgar Allan Poe National Historic Site, Valley Forge National Historical Park, Friendship Hill National Historic Site, Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Park, Eisenhower National Historic Site, Hopewell Furnace National Historic Site, Johnstown Flood National Memorial, Flight 93 National Memorial, Fort Necessity National Battlefield, and Gettysburg National Military Park. A brief look at them all to hopefully whet your appetite to visit in person, which is the only way to truly appreciate the value and worth of your national parks.
This is Independence National Historical Park here in the heart of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's an important park for many reasons, most notably because of the building behind me, which was originally called the State House, but we know it better today as Independence Hall. It was here in 1776 that we declared our independence from England. And again in 1787, the delegates meeting here with George Washington as the helm of this group wrote our Constitution. In addition to being literally the birthplace of our country at Independence Hall, we have some other interesting buildings just here on Independence Square. To my left is Old City Hall, and that was where the Supreme Court met. And to my far right is Congress Hall, which was the place where Congress met when Philadelphia, in the last decade of the 18th century, was the capital of our country. So here we had the executive branch, the judiciary branch, and the legislative branch, all within about a block of one another. If you walk through the park, you'll find a number of spectacular buildings that really talk about life in the 18th century, and a few actually from the 19th century as we were beginning this country. Carpenter's Hall, notable among them. Carpenter's Hall was owned and operated by the Carpenters Company of Philadelphia and is still owned by them to this very, very day. It's famous not only because of the Carpenters Company, but perhaps more so because it was the site of the First Continental Congress that met here in Philadelphia and offered what people call the olive branch, or the peace offering to the King of England, because they felt it was the governors and the Parliament that were treating Americans shabbily and didn't include them in decisions about taxation and so on. But it was too late. By then, the king declared that the colonies were in open rebellion, so the Second Continental Congress met up here at Independence Hall and said, let's just declare independence. But if you walk down toward Carpenter's Hall, you also pass some spectacular architecture. You go past the Second Bank of the United States. It looks like the Parthenon. It's a virtual copy by a man named Strickland, who built the bank and also built the Merchants Exchange Building, which is also in the park. Two wonderful examples of Greek Revival architecture in the early 19th century. There's also the First Bank of the United States. Why? Because we were the center in Philadelphia of the early federal banking system, and the economic power of the country really started around this area in terms of the banking industry.
Could you give me a little insight into the men who were here?
Well, in some respects they were diverse, in some respects they were not. Of course, as we know, they were male, they were white. They were relatively well-to-do. Some were lawyers, some were landowners, some had other types of occupations. But they all came with a purpose, and they wanted to debate the problems of the day. The big problems of the day being feeling as one, feeling as Americans, but still being a part of England, being a part of Britain. And so when they met here at Independence Hall, they really realized that they had to come out with a declaration, a statement. They also realized that to come out with a declaration of independence, it had to be unanimous. And so during some warm days and maybe some warm evenings down at City Tavern here in the park, they came out with a committee to draft this declaration. And chief among them was a guy named Thomas Jefferson. And so a couple of blocks from here on what was then the outskirts of Philadelphia at 7th and Market, which is very much inside the most densely part of the city today, he drafted this Declaration of Independence. It went through several changes because it was a committee, it was a group. Some of the things they took out were references to the slave trade, which would really come back to haunt America for hundreds of years thereafter, really until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. But the basic document did say that people were entitled to life, to liberty, to the pursuit of happiness. And even if we didn't include everybody, like women, like Africans, like others, we still had the germ of an idea. The germ of an idea that started with the Declaration of Independence and then came to fruition with the Constitution, because the interim documents didn't work. The Articles of Confederation let each state coin its own money and create its own barriers to trade and raise its own armies. So you really wanted to do something that brought us together as a nation. And so between the Declaration and the Constitution, the founders really developed a model for the most successful democracy on the planet.
What makes them so enduring?
Well, what makes it enduring is several things. One is that it can be changed, especially the Constitution. That when we realize something doesn't work, and we realized early on because there were those who didn't sign the Constitution because it didn't include a Bill of Rights. And so within just a few short 4 years after the Constitution was written, we had a Bill of Rights that was formally adopted as part of the Constitution over there in Congress Hall and outlined in those 10 amendments what things people could do, what things people couldn't do, outlined our freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, and any number of freedoms that we hold dear today. But that didn't end it. It was modified many, many other times and continues to have the potential for modification today. And so if you think about it, you realize that what the framers put together was something that they thought was as good as they could possibly get for that time, but still had the ability to be modified to meet the changing ideas of today. We see that not only here in Independence Hall, but down the other end of the mall at the National Constitution Center, which really talks well beyond the time period of the park. We're a colonial park. We talk about things that happened up to about 1800 and a little bit beyond. National Constitution Center, located within the park on the other end of Independence Mall, is the balance between Independence Hall and modern times. They talk about the Constitution, how it's been changed, how it's been modified, how it's been challenged, and how it affects our lives today.
And switching gears a little bit, tell us about the park and how many people visit it and why do they come and that sort of thing.
The park, with all of its buildings, gets about 5 million visits each year. So many, many people come to this park. And they come not only from all over the country, but from all over the world. We have our exhibits and displays and audio and video in many languages because that broken bell, silenced as it is, still calls to people. 250 years after it was first made and hung in the Tower of Independence Hall, because it's become a symbol of something greater, a symbol of people seeking freedom, of holding freedom dear and willing to sacrifice, just as people did in the American Revolution, their very lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to make it a reality. Throughout the rest of the park, people come to see where it all took place. Independence Hall is not a church, it's not a mosque, it's not a synagogue. We don't have a state religion. But if there's a holy place that people come to that's not affiliated with any real religion, it's Independence Hall, because again, people realize that something very special happened in that. The birth of the United States, but more so the birth of ideas, the ideas that people can be free. Other things that people may or may not know about the park is that we also include Benjamin Franklin's home site. He was not a native of Philadelphia, he was born in Boston, but he left, ran away at an early age, became a very successful printer here in Philadelphia, retired at the age of 42 and spent the second 42 years of his life dabbling in such things as scientific experiments, diplomacy, and government. We're also the home to the Liberty Bell, which for about 93 years rang in the Tower of Independence Hall and then cracked and never rang again. But nevertheless has become an international symbol of freedom attained and freedom not yet achieved.
Do people come to Philadelphia to kind of reappreciate the United States and for what we are?
Well, even though people's roots may not be in the colonial period, maybe their ancestors didn't come here in the Mayflower, maybe with the early Spanish settlers, or maybe they weren't here when those people showed up as Native Americans, I think it's common roots. It's a common bond as people, whether you were a citizen back when Washington and Franklin walked the streets, or whether you became a citizen on Constitution Day last week. It really calls to people and says, get back to us as Americans. Beyond that, when you see people from other countries and other cultures, it's their appreciation for things uniquely American. It's the appreciation for the ideals that they have, which are really not American ideals, but they're human ideals that calls to people from all over the world.
Ranger-guided tours are conducted throughout the day here at Independence Hall.
Okay, folks, we're going to go all the way inside and to our left. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Independence Hall. But of course, if you were around during the colonial era, this building had an entirely different name. It was called the Pennsylvania State House. This was the seat of government for Pennsylvania for many years, from 1732, when the building was first constructed, all the way up to 1799. Eventually, the state capital would move westward to its current location in Harrisburg. But upon the completion of the Pennsylvania State House here, this was perhaps the grandest, largest colonial capitol building ever constructed in British North America, built by Pennsylvanians for Pennsylvanians. And all sorts of interesting events occurred here in this building. Obviously, if you had business with the governor, well, you walked up the 42 steps up to the second floor. There was an adjoining long gallery next to the governor's office where there were banquets and dinners and parties held. In the small munitions room and committee room as well. And the assembly, the legislature of Pennsylvania, ordinarily met in the room across the hall. And it was here in the highest court in Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court chamber, where they practiced something called English common law. Characteristics of English common law include the right of the accused to have a trial by jury, the right to have an attorney represent you, the right to a fair and speedy trial open to the public, as well as the presumption of innocence until proven guilty for criminal cases. Now, those of you from the United States, do these concepts sound completely off the wall to you? Hopefully they don't, because it's in our Constitution. As you look around the room doesn't look all that far removed of a courtroom you would see even today here in the United States. It was here in this small room where we became a nation. It was here where the Declaration of Independence was adopted, July the 4th, 1776. So take a look around, ladies and gentlemen. This is where the United States of America was born. So they created a Congress with two houses. One would be based on the population of each state. That became the House of Representatives. But to balance that, they also created the role of the Senate to represent all the states equally. 2 senators for each state would be created, regardless of the state's size or population. They also created a Supreme Court under this proposal, because that's all it was, ladies and gentlemen, a proposal.
The 2 most important treasures in this room are the chair with the rising sun used by Washington during the Constitutional Convention, and the silver inkwell designed by Philip Syng, which was used for signing both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The Federal Congress met in Congress Hall from 1790 to 1800, when Philadelphia was the capital of the United States. The Senate met here on the second floor in a smaller but more elaborately decorated room, whereas the House of Representatives met here on the main floor in what might be described as a more utilitarian environment. Over 55 acres and 20 city blocks of history, this park preserves and interprets some of the most important resources associated with the establishment of the United States of America. The Independence Hall Visitor Center is where you arrange guided tours. It's a great place to begin your visit with a variety of exhibits and information about the park and tour schedules. This is where tours are organized. Also nearby is the Benjamin Franklin National Memorial, a 20-foot statue located inside the Franklin Institute. Edgar Allan Poe lived in Philadelphia for 6 years, which most agree were his most productive and happiest. The Edgar Allan Poe National Historic Site celebrates his gift of writing. Polish freedom fighter Thaddeus Kosciuszko was celebrated by Thomas Jefferson, in his words, as pure a son of liberty as I have ever known. Open only on weekends, it's here you can learn more about this remarkable man and his contribution as a volunteer in the American Revolution. The Gloria Dei Church National Historic Site in Philadelphia celebrates the oldest church in Pennsylvania. Established in 1700, Old Swedes Church, as it is affectionately known, has been a spiritual anchor for over 300 years. It began as a Lutheran parish, then in 1845 became part of the Episcopal Church. It continues as an active Episcopal parish in the 21st century. The church cemetery was also established in the early 1700s and contains many graves for members of George Washington's army. Everywhere you turn in Philadelphia, another historic building. Elfreth's Alley, it's said, is the oldest continuously occupied street in America. 32 buildings built from 1720 to 1830 line this narrow carriage path. During the third year of the Revolutionary War, over the winter of 1777 and 78, this was General Washington's winter encampment, now preserved and interpreted by the Valley Forge National Historical Park. Here, he and his 11,000 men endured a harsh winter after having lost 2 battles to the British at Brandywine and Germantown. Nearly 2,000 men died here from disease, cold, and starvation. A difficult time for all, but it was here they regrouped, spent the winter, were drilled and trained by Baron Frederick von Steuben in the arts of war. In addition, he introduced latrines and new hygiene standards to the camp that improved life, health, and morale to the previously somewhat slovenly troops. The park is here, about 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia. The Visitor Center has a terrific display of artifacts from the period and information about the encampment. Trams leave regularly for a tour of the park. Bicycles are available for rent, or you can bring your own. And the tour road is open to private vehicles if you'd rather. Along the tour road, there are examples of the 2,000 or so cabins that once were here. Some are open to give visitors a real sense of what it was like back in the day. This is the Muhlenberg Brigade area. At various times, living history demonstrations are given here by volunteers and rangers dressed in 18th century attire. There are other layouts of cabin locations along the way. The National Memorial Arch is the largest monument in the park, commemorating Washington and his Continental Army's arrival to Valley Forge. There are a number of monuments placed throughout the park, commemorating various units who were there. Washington's headquarters is here near the Schuylkill River. He rented the house from Mrs. Deborah Hughes for 100 pounds in Pennsylvania currency. Washington felt it was important to pay for lodging rather than just take it, which was the way of the British Army. The interior of Washington's headquarters is decorated with period pieces and reproductions to give visitors a feeling that he and his staff were just there a few minutes before. Nearby, his personal guards built cabins to remain close to their general. There, of course, is much, much more to see here, but hopefully this little bit will entice a personal visit, which is the only way to truly appreciate the beauty and value of your national parks. Before the American Revolution, Hopewell Furnace Iron Works was established in 1772, creating stoves and other iron products molded at the factory. Later, as George Washington was forming his Continental Army, Hopewell became an important supplier of cannon and cannonballs to General Washington's army. Hopewell Furnace National Historic Site, established in 1983, is in southeastern Pennsylvania, about 50 miles northwest of Philadelphia. An entire village grew up around the ironworks, which was in operation for about 100 years. The visitor center is not huge, but contains a lot of information about the site, as well as maps for the various attractions here. Rangers are a font of information about the history of Hopewell Furnace and the region. Preserved and restored at the park are the owner's house, a company store. One room even contains the bins where various flours and meals were stored. Even price boards for items that were available at the store. Across the lane, the Draft Horse Barn, a very important building to the company, since transport of the materials and the finished iron was all done with teams of draft horses. The blacksmith shop is filled with tools from the period. The smithy shop was also a social gathering place. The most interesting building, the large molding shop and furnace room, plus a working water wheel. This wheel has been replaced several times throughout the history of the foundry. The most recent one was installed in 2006. It can develop up to 15 horsepower, which was used to run the blast furnace machinery. The concept of water wheels dates back to the 1st century BC, when it was described in writing by a Roman engineer, though the first record of one being used was in the 4th century AD in southern France. The large charcoal cooling shed and storage room are on the next level above. On this level is where fillers fed the blast furnace. It was a hungry beast, requiring them to dump into what is called the tunnel head 400 to 500 pounds of iron ore, 30 to 40 pounds of limestone, and 15 bushels of charcoal every half hour. They worked 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. The area surrounding Hopewell had all the raw materials for making iron. Iron ore was mined nearby, less than 5 miles from the furnace. There were extensive forests of native hardwoods from which charcoal could be made, with the third material, limestone, mined in nearby Connecticut. Colliers, who were the workers who went into the forest, cut wood, piled it in a specific form, and then lit fires to create the charcoal, ending up with a charcoal pit that looked like this one, which is in the park. After the burn, It was taken to a cooling shed for a short time, then transferred into the charcoal house. Water was channeled through a mile-long head race from a nearby lake to move this huge water wheel, 22 feet high and 5 feet wide. The water turned the wheel, which was attached to two pistons on each side that opened and closed large bellows, two huge blowers that drove air through piping to the furnace, getting the temperatures up to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit to melt the iron ore. On the lower level is the molding shop, where carpenters built molds to create stoves, stove plates, and other items built here. The molds are filled with sand, a pattern is drawn, and then molten iron is poured into the mold to form the parts needed for a stove or whatever else they were making. They also made pig iron bars for refining elsewhere. Pig iron was so called because the pattern in which the molds were filled looked like a sow feeding her piglets. Once the Revolutionary War started, cannons and cannonballs were the focus of manufacturing here. Hopewell Furnace is a look back to the early history of manufacturing, with well-preserved buildings and artifacts, plus how difficult it was for a company to survive as technology and demand changed over the years. From the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, this was one of the most popular tourist destinations in the East. With many hotels, resorts, and summer retreats, it served thousands of visitors during its day. Now it's a centerpiece for Water Gap National Recreation Area. About 2 hours north of Philadelphia, and even closer to New York City, the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area is a popular getaway during all seasons, but for most, it's a summer destination and an easy weekend outing. In addition to all the recreation opportunities, there are dozens of historic buildings and locations through the park. Once considered a wonder of the world, the Gap itself is a quarter-mile wide at the river and nearly a mile wide at the mountaintops. About 250 miles west of the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area, a group of wealthy Pittsburghers established the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club on picturesque Lake Conemaugh. All that's left of the lake are remains of the breached earthen dam. The club's dam gave way on May 31, 1889, resulting in the death of over 2,200 people, devastating the small community of Johnstown. The Johnstown Flood National Memorial was established in 1964, commemorating the lives of those who perished in the flood. The Visitor Center tells their story in graphic detail and photos from when the dam was rebuilt after a previous dam break in 1862 to the days after the catastrophic event in 1889, just 7 years later. A combination of events led to the disaster. The dam was rebuilt after the dam break in 1862. This particular break was mitigated by low water in the lake, a dry year, with the rivers very low. It gave the citizens in Johnstown some concern, but not enough to move on. The dam rebuild was substandard with a redesign that was bound to fail. The spillway was only 7 or 8 feet below the top of the dam and had been covered with screen to keep fish from escaping. And a bridge over the top was added, which could also catch debris. The control tower had burned, and discharge pipes had been removed. Torrential rains filled the lake to overcapacity. Logs and debris clogged the spillway. Water began overflowing the top of the dam, causing the collapse. Citizens in Johnstown were warned by telegraph in advance the dam was going to fail, but few heeded the warnings. In addition to the visitor center and dam site, the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club's clubhouse is open for ranger-led tours. At Johnstown, Clara Barton's American Red Cross arrived to provide relief for survivors. It was the first time the American Red Cross had the opportunity to offer assistance in a peacetime disaster. Under Barton's direction, the American Red Cross distributed supplies valued at over $200,000, helping over 25,000 people. This is Fort Necessity National Battlefield, where young 22-year-old Lieutenant Colonel George Washington engaged in the first major event in his military career. Fort Necessity is here in southeastern Pennsylvania, about 11 miles east of Uniontown on Highway 40. Washington was sent here to extend the British military road. The time period was mid-1754, during the French and Indian War, when Washington arrived at Great Meadows. The French were making incursions into the area, so Washington's troops, the Virginia and South Carolina regiments, built an earthworks fort, then a stockade shelter in the middle. The French and Indians attacked. Washington's troops fought valiantly, but after 9 hours, half his 400 troops were either sick, wounded, or dead, giving Washington little choice but to surrender. Negotiations with the French allowed Washington to leave with his sick and wounded and his small arms to return to, as the French put it, his own country, implying this was now French territory. They eventually burned the stockade. The British persisted and sent Major General Edward Braddock to attack Fort Duquesne. Braddock was killed during a battle with the French. He was leading about half his 2,400-man army to capture Fort Duquesne in the upper Ohio Valley when they were attacked by a French and Indian patrol. 2/3 of Braddock's men and most of their officers were killed or wounded, including Braddock. General Braddock's gravesite is also part of the Fort Necessity National Battlefield. He died later in the day, and his troops buried him secretly in the middle of his road, in an unmarked grave to keep the French and Indians from disturbing their slain general. His remains were later reinterred to their present resting place. The scar Braddock's campaign road runs past his grave. It eventually extended all the way to the Monongahela River and was the main road west until it was replaced by the National Road, which more or less is where U.S. Highway 40 runs today. Also in the park, the Mount Washington Tavern, built in 1830. It was along the National Road, which was an extension of the earlier military road Washington and others built. The National Road was proposed by Washington in the late 1700s. It was the first federally funded road, eventually stretching 600 miles connecting Cumberland to Vandalia, Illinois, by 1839. The tavern was a stage stop for several different stage lines. This was one of the nicer establishments along the road, catering to travelers, offering overnight accommodations, food, drink, stables, and feed for livestock. The stables here also supplied fresh teams to the stages, since they normally would change teams every 10 to 15 miles during their day's travel of 60 or 70 miles, depending on the conditions. Guests here generally slept fully clothed, men and women in different rooms. Friendship Hill National Historic Site is the country estate of one of America's early patriots. Albert Gallatin immigrated to the United States from Switzerland in 1780. Though not particularly well known, Gallatin became a staunch and active player in the post-revolutionary shaping of the country. His home is open for self-guided tours. He may best be known for his one-year stint as Secretary of the Treasury during the Jefferson and Madison administrations, during which time he reduced the national debt, purchased the Louisiana Territory, doubling the size of the United States, and funded the Lewis and Clark expedition. Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Park is a small park in Pennsylvania about 12 miles west of Altoona, preserving a piece of America's railroading history. The Visitor Center and Park celebrate the first railroad to cross the Allegheny Mountains. The railroad, 36 miles long, was the crucial link in the Pennsylvania Mainline Canal. It was used to move canal boats over the mountains to connect with another canal on the other side. There were 10 inclines, 5 on each side of the mountains. This was the highest of the engine houses that raised and lowered the train cars using stationary steam engines with a rope and pulley system. On the flat levels of the trip between the inclines, horses and then later locomotives were used to tow the cars. When it was finished, it was possible to travel between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia by canal and rail in 4 days, a trip that previously took a minimum of 23 days by wagon. Here, too, the Lemon House, which was a very busy roadhouse and tavern during the heyday of the railroad. It's been refurnished and decorated to the period. Steamtown National Historic Park is a railroad museum that covers about 60 acres of what was once the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad Yard in Scranton, Pennsylvania. There's an extensive museum dedicated to early railroad history in the United States with an emphasis on steam engines. Depending on the season and scheduling, there are all sorts of outdoor activities going on, with train rides around the rail yards as well as other excursions. The roundhouse is particularly unique to the steam era and is an exciting attraction to experience when it's working. Tours of the restoration shop brings visitors an up-close and personal introduction to how tedious and complicated is the work of restoring a magnificent steam locomotive. Finding parts to make the repair usually requires fabricating them from scratch, which is an art in itself. Outside in the rail yards are all sorts of old railroad rolling stock in various stages of repair. These engines from the Reading Railroad look almost new. The steam engine was originally built in the 1920s and rebuilt in 1947. It could haul 150 cars filled with coal. Flight 93 National Memorial near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, honors the 40 brave souls who sacrificed their lives to stop terrorists who had hijacked their flight from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco, California. One must visit this memorial to feel the impact these people and this memorial have on our lives and for those others who perished in the 9/11 attack. Gettysburg National Military Park marks a turning point in the Civil War, memorializing those valiant men on both sides who fought, were wounded, and died here. Gettysburg is in southeastern Pennsylvania, a little over 100 miles west of Philadelphia. There's a large visitor center, which is the place to plan your tour of this very expansive park. It's spread out over 10 square miles of farmland and the community of Gettysburg. There are a variety of tours and attractions here, as well as a few free exhibits in the visitor center. The three-day battle at Gettysburg was arguably the largest ever fought in North America, involving over 160,000 soldiers and officers. When the smoke cleared, 51,000 Americans were killed, wounded, captured, or missing. To grasp the significance of the proportions of this encounter, almost as many soldiers died in 3 days of combat here as during the entire war in Vietnam. Of all the soldiers in the Civil War, 25% would never return home to their loved ones. In the park are over 1,400 monuments, markers, and memorials, over 26 miles of roads covering about 8 square miles. Consider the impact this engagement had on the 2,000 or so residents in the community of Gettysburg and surrounding farms. Driving through the various battlefields, it becomes apparent that fighting was going on in and around farms and those who lived and worked here. Certainly the landscape has changed a bit since then, but in reality, not all that much. Every large building in Gettysburg, churches, schools, stores, and hotels were used as hospitals after the battle. Not only were there dead combatants everywhere, but horses and mules too. There were few doctors, nurses, and medical supplies. The sounds of the injured echoed across the landscape as limbs were amputated without anesthetic. It was a horrific scene from which many residents likely never fully recovered. At the dedication of the National Cemetery in Gettysburg is where President Lincoln gave his historic Gettysburg Address. There are 6,000 buried here. 3,580 are Union soldiers, half of which are unknown soldiers. Near where President Lincoln gave his speech is the Soldiers' National Monument, erected 6 years later, which has become the centerpiece of the cemetery. About 300 yards away, a monument to President Lincoln's memorable speech. In Gettysburg, the historic Gettysburg Square. The town's train station, where President Lincoln arrived, which, after the battle, served as a field hospital. The David Wills House, where Lincoln stayed and finished his Gettysburg Address, is open for self-guided tours. The Eisenhower National Historic Site is also here at Gettysburg, just a few miles from the Visitor Center, from which ranger-guided tours are conducted. His farm served as a weekend retreat for the president, a rural setting he could meet with world leaders. He bought the farm in 1950, 3 years before he became president. This is the only home he and his wife Mimi ever owned. They bought the 189-acre farm for $40,000. It came with 25 head of cattle and 600 chickens. The house was extensively remodeled after he became president. A putting green was also added. The Eisenhowers donated the property to the National Park Service with lifetime living rights. After their deaths, the Eisenhower National Historic Site opened to the public in 1980. In addition to the Eisenhower National Historic Site, the national parks in Pennsylvania are the stories of heroes and the common man, preserving and interpreting some of this country's earliest history, in addition to a look at what was arguably the turning point of a bloody war, in which for the most part only Americans died, fighting one another. The National Park Service has over 400 entities it lists as official units of the National Park System. In addition to national parks, this list includes military parks, battlefields, historic sites and parks, historical parks, monuments, preserves, memorials, recreation areas, parkways, trails, wild rivers, scenic riverways, sea and lake shores. But as they say in those infamous infomercials, but wait, there's more? Over 80,000 more national treasures within the Park Service fold. Natural landmarks, historic places, heritage areas like Motor Cities in Detroit or smokestacks and silos in rural Iowa. The vast collection of natural and historic sites within the National Park Service purview is what this series, Discoveries America National Parks, is all about. Once finished, we'll have over 40 one-hour programs to help you explore this vast and remarkable United States of America. Thanks for watching this episode of Discoveries America National Parks.